I'm telling you, this plate came back stolen.
I'm asking you to verify it. The car is registered to me.
Step back and stop arguing.
I'm not arguing. I'm asking why.
Dispatch, send another unit to Camelback and 68th.
A cop insisted the plate was stolen and treated him like a suspect, until one sentence revealed he was an FBI supervisor, and everything changed instantly. The brake lights behind him weren't flashing for anyone else. They were for him. And Evan Brooks, already halfway through a turn onto East Camelback Road in Scottsdale, Arizona, knew it. He eased his charcoal sedan to the curb, blinkers on, engine still running. Afternoon sun bounced off storefront windows and windshields, bright enough to sting the eyes. People drove by without a second look. That part always struck him. Life never pauses for moments like these. He checked his mirrors. Hands on the wheel. Phone slipped discreetly into the center console, camera rolling. "Here we go," he said under his breath. Boots scraped gravel as the officer approached. Evan didn't turn his head. He waited. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Evan passed them through the window. "Sure. May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer didn't look at him. He studied the license longer than necessary, then glanced at the plate, then back at Evan's face. "Your rear plate flagged as possibly stolen." Evan blinked once, slowly. "That can't be right. The car's registered to me. Same plate I've had for years." The officer leaned back, hand hovering too close to his belt. "That's not what the system says." Evan kept his voice level. "Would you like the registration?" "I already have what I need." The radio on the officer's shoulder crackled. He angled his body, half blocking traffic, half blocking Evan's view of anything else. Another patrol car rolled by and didn't stop. Evan felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear. Focus. "What's your destination today?" the officer asked. "Home? Where's that?" Evan glanced at him. "I live about 10 minutes that way." "That neighborhood?" "Yes." The officer's eyes stayed on him. "You seem tense." Evan let out a controlled breath. "I'm being told my license plate might be stolen. I'd say that makes sense." The officer didn't respond. He stepped back, spoke into his radio in a low voice, numbers Evan couldn't hear. Then louder. "Dispatch, can you rerun plate Bravo 71? He stopped mid-sentence, looked again. Squinted. Evan watched his face change, just a little. "Sir," the officer said, "step out of the vehicle." Evan paused. "Am I being detained?" "Yes." "For what reason?" "Suspected vehicle fraud." Evan nodded once. He opened the door slowly, keeping his hands visible. Heat hit his face. The air smelled like asphalt and hot rubber. Another cruiser pulled in behind, nose angled sharp. Back up. The second officer stayed inside his car, watching. Evan stood where told, feet shoulder-width apart. "Any weapons?" the first officer asked. "No." "Anything in the vehicle I should know about?" "No." The officer circled the car, tapped the trunk, ran his finger along the plate like he expected it to peel off. "You mind explaining how this plate ended up on your car?" he asked. Evan turned his head carefully. "Because I registered the vehicle legally through the state. You're welcome to verify that." The officer's tone hardened. "I'm asking questions." "And I'm answering them." Traffic rolled past. A bus hissed as it stopped down the block. A couple on the sidewalk slowed, pretended not to stare. The officer stepped closer. "Where are you really coming from?" Evan met his eyes. "From work?" "What kind of work?" Evan hesitated, just long enough to change the room. "I work for the federal government." The officer let out a short laugh. "Everyone does." Evan didn't smile. "I'm a supervisory special agent." Silence landed heavy. The officer's radio crackled again. He looked down at it like it had betrayed him. "Say that again," he said. Evan's voice stayed calm. "I supervise federal investigations. I was returning from an interagency meeting in Phoenix." The officer stepped back, radio back to his mouth, faster this time. Codes. Corrections. A different tone, dispatch replied. The officer's shoulders dropped. His jaw worked. He cleared his throat. There appears to have been an input error. Evan waited. The plate was entered incorrectly. Evan held his gaze. So I'm free to go? Yes, the officer said, already stepping away. You can go. No apology. No explanation, just a wave toward the door. Evan got back into his car, hands steady. He pulled into traffic, heart still pounding, phone still recording. But the drive home didn't quiet anything, because moments like that don't stay on the side of the road. By the time Evan Brooks pulled into his driveway, the sun had shifted just enough to glare through the windshield. He shut the engine off, but didn't move. Not right away. His phone sat in the console, warm from recording. No apology, he said quietly. Not even a reason. Inside, the house felt still. Too still. He dropped his keys into the bowl by the door and leaned against the counter, replaying the stop in his head like bad footage you wish you could edit. Hand near the belt. Why are you really here? That pause after federal government. Evan pressed the phone to his ear and called his sister, Alana Brooks, who lived in Tempe, Arizona. They tried to say my plate was stolen, he told her. What? She said. That doesn't even make sense. It didn't to them either, until it suddenly did. She went quiet for a moment. Did you get the officer's name? Evan checked the video. The angle caught part of the badge. Officer Kyle Renner, Patrol Unit 34. Alana exhaled slowly. You're not letting this slide. No, Evan said. I'm not. That night, he sent the footage to his agency's legal liaison. Not as a complaint. Not yet. Just documentation. A record. Something solid. The next morning, his phone lit up before he finished his coffee. Evan, this is Marian Feld, Office of Professional Responsibility. Her voice carried the careful calm of someone who already knew where the conversation was headed. We've reviewed your footage, she said. There are discrepancies. That's one word for it. There was no valid alert on your plate, Marian continued. None at all. So why say there was? Silence. Then, that's what we're trying to determine. Later that afternoon, a request came from the Maricopa County Police Department. Not an apology. A meeting. Evan drove to the station in his own car. Same plate, same route. The irony didn't escape him. Officer Renner wasn't alone in the room. 2 supervisors sat with him. One took notes. The other stared at the table. Renner kept his arms crossed. I followed procedure, he said. The system flagged it. Evan leaned back in his chair. Your system didn't flag anything. Dispatch confirmed that. Renner shrugged. Errors happen. Errors don't explain your questions, Evan replied. Where I was headed? If I belonged there. Renner looked up. Those are standard. They're not, Evan said. And you know that. The note-taker paused. Renner's jaw worked. I assess situations. You escalated one without cause. One of the supervisors cleared his throat. Officer Renner, did you call for backup before confirming the plate? Renner didn't answer right away. Yes? Why? Renner's eyes flicked to Evan, then away. Officer safety. Evan leaned forward. I told you the car was mine. I offered registration. You refused to look. Renner's voice sharpened. People lie. Do you always assume that? Evan asked. Or just with some people? The room went quiet. The supervisor closed the folder. That'll be all for now. Outside, Evan sat in his car for a long moment before driving off. The meeting hadn't brought relief. It stirred something else. A familiar frustration mixed with clarity. 2 days later, a local reporter called. Mr. Brooks, we received a tip about a traffic stop involving federal personnel, she said. Do you want to comment? Evan hesitated. He thought about the officer's shrug. The way the situation deflated only after his job came up. Yes, he said. I do. The story aired that evening. No dramatic music. Just facts. Video clips. Subtitles. Jianan license plate entered incorrectly. Stop lacked legal basis. Department reviewing conduct. Comments poured in. Some supportive, some dismissive. Should have complied harder. Why play the card? Must have been something else. Evan closed the app. The following week, he received an official notice. Internal Affairs had opened a formal investigation. Officer Renner was placed on administrative leave. Alana called again. "You okay?" "I am," Evan said. "But this isn't just about me." "No," she agreed. "It never is." That night, Evan sat on his porch in Mesa, Arizona, watching cars pass. Plates clean, untouched, no questions asked. He thought about how close the stop came to becoming something worse, how thin the line felt. But the roadside was only the beginning, because once the questions reached daylight, they refused to stay contained. The official email arrived on a Thursday morning. Plain subject line, no drama. Evan Brooks opened it between meetings, expecting more legal phrasing, more waiting. Instead, it read like a crack in a wall. Officer Kyle Renner's body camera footage had been reviewed in full. Dispatch logs matched Evan's recording down to the second. No stolen plate alert. No misread return. No system fault. The claim never existed. Evan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling of the federal building in Phoenix, Arizona. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. He'd spent years in rooms just like this one, reviewing other people's mistakes, other people's explanations. It felt strange being on the opposite side. Later that afternoon, Marion Feld called him directly. "They want a second interview," she said. "This time, it's different." "How so?" "They're not treating this as a misunderstanding anymore." When Evan arrived at the department headquarters in Peoria, Arizona, the tone confirmed it. Different room, different seating. A recorder placed openly on the table. Renner came in last. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, just pressed in. No crossed arms this time. "Officer Renner," the internal investigator began, "do you maintain that you believed the plate was stolen?" Renner cleared his throat. "At the time, yes." "And dispatch confirms there was no such alert," the investigator said. Renner shifted in his chair. "I must have misremembered." Evan spoke calmly. "You repeated the claim multiple times. You called for backup before checking. That's not misremembering." Renner shot him a look. "I was doing my job." The investigator raised a hand. "Officer, you also questioned why Mr. Brooks was in the area." Renner shrugged. "I assess context." "What context?" Evan asked. Renner hesitated. The silence dragged. Finally, he muttered, "It didn't sit right." The investigator leaned forward. "Explain that." Renner's eyes moved around the room. "Nice car. Expensive neighborhood. I see patterns." Evan let that land. "So you made one up," he said. "A stolen plate, because reality didn't match your expectation." Renner's face flushed. "That's not what I said." "It is," Evan replied, just with different words. The recorder clicked softly as it captured everything. 2 days later, the department released a statement. No names, no faces, violation of conduct, false grounds for detention, failure to follow procedure. Renner was suspended without pay pending termination review. That same day, Evan's attorney, Shauna Green, called. "They're offering a settlement discussion," she said. "Already?" "Yes, quietly." They met in a conference room overlooking Temecula, California, neutral ground. City buildings stretching low and wide under heat haze. Across the table sat representatives from the city and their insurer. Polite, careful. "We acknowledge harm," one of them said. "We'd like to resolve this without litigation." Shauna slid a folder forward. "My client was illegally detained, threatened with arrest, escalated without cause." This was recorded. One of the reps sighed. "What are you asking?" "Accountability," Evan said, "and compensation that reflects impact." They took a break. Came back with numbers. Higher than expected. Still not enough. Negotiations stretched over weeks. Back and forth. Language adjusted. Liability weighed. Outside the room, Evan answered texts from coworkers who'd seen the story spread. Glad you're okay. This happens more than people think. Thank you for not letting it go. The city finally agreed. A settlement totaling $6.4 million. No admission of wrongdoing. Mandatory retraining added quietly to the agreement. The number didn't bring satisfaction. It brought relief mixed with something heavier. At the press conference in Riverside, California, cameras flashed. Evan kept his statement short. This was never about money, he said. It was about stopping a lie before it became routine. A reporter asked, "Do you think the officer would have let you go if you hadn't revealed your position?" Evan didn't answer right away. "No," he said. "I don't." The room went still. That night, Evan drove home again. Same streets, same plate, same car, different weight. But as the case closed on paper, the deeper cost lingered because resolution doesn't erase what follows you afterward. The first night after the press conference, Evan Brooks slept lightly. Not because of fear, because his mind wouldn't slow down. Every time a car passed his house in Chandler, Arizona, his eyes opened. The quiet felt different now, charged, not calm. He sat up just before dawn and checked his phone. Messages stacked up overnight. Some from colleagues, some from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Glad you stood your ground. Saw the footage, that was wrong. This could have been any of us. There were others too. Why make it public? Cops have a hard job, You should have kept your mouth shut. Evan scrolled, then set the phone down face up on the nightstand. He took a breath and stood, joints stiff, shoulders heavy. In the kitchen, he poured coffee and stared out the window. Same street, same houses, same parked cars, different awareness. At work, the looks changed. Nothing hostile, just longer pauses. People choosing words carefully. "You doing all right?" a colleague asked near the elevators. "I'm good," Evan said. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie. That afternoon, he sat in on a briefing where body camera policy came up. A junior agent referenced his case without naming it. "Public trust matters," the agent said. "Perception shapes outcomes." Evan listened, arms folded. He recognized the irony. He'd given that speech himself before, just never from this angle. On his way out, Marion Feld caught up with him. "They finalized Renner's termination," she said. Evan nodded. "I figured." "There's also a civil review panel hearing," Marion added. "They want you to testify." "When?" "Next month." Evan exhaled. Of course they do. That weekend, his parents drove up from Tucson, Arizona. His mother hugged him tighter than usual. "I watched that stop over and over," she said. "You handled it better than I would have." His father shook his head. "That officer didn't see you." "Not really." They sat around the dining table, plates half full, conversations circling the same thought from different angles. "What if you weren't who you are?" his mother asked. Evan didn't answer right away. He folded his napkin carefully. "I think about that every time I drive now," he said. Later that night, he walked the block. A simple loop. Streetlights casting long lines across pavement. A patrol car rolled past at the corner and kept going. His shoulders tensed anyway. Across town, a community forum aired on local television. Residents debated traffic stops, department culture, accountability. One caller said, "If it can happen to someone with power, imagine everyone else." Evan watched from his couch, remote resting on his chest. The next week, training bulletins went out. Quiet ones, policy refreshers, language updates. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but it mattered. A few days later, he received an email from a man named Luis Herrera in Yuma, Arizona. "I saw what happened to you, but..." The message read, "Same officer pulled me over last year. Said my tag was suspicious too. I never fought it. I just wanted to go home." Evan read it twice. Then he replied. They spoke on the phone that evening. Luis described the stop, the tone, the questions. the way it ended without any paperwork. Evan closed his eyes as he listened. Patterns didn't need charts. After the call, he forwarded the message to Shauna Green with a short note. "This matters." The civil hearing arrived faster than expected. Evan sat at the long table under bright lights, hands folded, voice steady. "What did the stop feel like to you?" a panel member asked. Evan thought carefully. "It felt like I had to prove I belonged in my own life." The room stayed silent. Driving home that day, Evan took the long route through Gilbert, Arizona. Not avoiding anything, just thinking. He realized something uncomfortable. The settlement closed a case, the headlines faded, but the awareness stayed. Every mirror check, every slow breath, every decision to record before being asked. But even as routines settled back in place, Evan knew the real aftermath wasn't about him anymore, because what came next would reach far beyond a single stop. The hearing didn't end with applause or raised voices. It ended with paperwork. Thick packets, signatures, dates that locked decisions in place. Officer Kyle Renner's badge was officially revoked on a Monday morning. No cameras, no statement read aloud. Just a notice posted quietly on the department's internal board. Evan Brooks found out the same way he found out most things lately, through an email forwarded 3 times before it reached him. He stared at the screen longer than he expected. "Does that do anything for you?" Shauna Green asked later that day. They were seated across from each other in her office in Ontario, California, blinds half drawn. "I don't know," Evan said honestly. "It feels final, but not satisfying." Shauna leaned back. "That's common. Accountability doesn't always match the emotion." Outside the office, the case kept moving on its own momentum. The City Council scheduled a public session to review traffic stop data. Advocacy groups requested reports going back 5 years. Supervisors started asking questions they hadn't asked before. Patterns surfaced. Slowly, reluctantly. Stops justified by vague alerts. Verbal warnings replacing written records. Complaints dismissed as misunderstandings. A council member in Mesa, Arizona said it out loud during one meeting. "We need to stop pretending these are isolated." That sentence traveled farther than any headline. Evan didn't attend every session. He learned early that watching too closely drained him. Still, people kept pulling him into the discussion. At a grocery store, at the gas pump, in line for coffee. "Aren't you the guy from the video?" a man asked in Goodyear, Arizona. "Yes," Evan said. "Thanks," the man replied, then walked away. At work, leadership asked Evan to consult on a new review framework. Not because of his role, because of his experience. He hesitated before agreeing. During the first meeting, a young analyst asked, "How do we change behavior, not just policy?" Evan thought about the stop, the pause, the instant that everything shifted only when power entered the conversation. "You require truth before force." "So," he said, "every time. Without shortcuts." The room wrote it down. Meanwhile, Renner's name surfaced again. Not in court. In union filings, appeals, claims of unfair treatment. Evan wasn't involved. He wasn't asked to be. That distance surprised him. It brought relief mixed with guilt he didn't expect. One evening, Alana called. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked. "Sometimes," Evan admitted. "Do you feel bad?" Evan paused. "I feel aware." That weekend, he attended a small community workshop in Surprise, Arizona. Folding chairs, coffee in paper cups. About 30 people, no cameras. A woman in the back raised her hand. "My son got pulled over last month. Same thing. Plate issue. I told him about your case." Evan nodded. "Did it change anything?" "He recorded," she said. "They let him go quick," the room murmured. Afterward, a retired officer approached Evan. "I wore that uniform for 30 years, the man said. "What happened to you shouldn't have happened, but pretending it doesn't happen only makes it worse." Evan thanked him. Driving home that night, Evan reflected on something he hadn't expected. The money sat untouched in a separate account. It didn't bring comfort. It brought responsibility. He used part of it to fund legal clinics in Yavapai County, Arizona, quietly, without attaching his name. Another portion went toward community recording workshops. Teach people their rights. Teach them calm. He didn't announce it. He just did it. The world didn't change overnight. But small adjustments showed up. A department memo here. A supervisor pushing back there. A stop that ended earlier than it used to. One afternoon, Evan was pulled over again. Broken taillight. Different town. Different officer. The officer explained the reason immediately. Checked the light. Issued a warning. No extra questions. Evan drove away and laughed once. Short. Surprised. But accountability wasn't the ending he expected, because its real weight only showed when it began changing people who were never part of the story. A month after everything slowed down, Evan Brooks took a drive without a destination. No meetings, no calls queued up, just movement. Highway lanes stretched ahead near Casa Grande, Arizona, heat wavering above the asphalt. He kept both hands on the wheel, radio low, windows up. The habit stuck. He thought about how many times people had asked him the same question since the video spread. Would you still be alive if you weren't who you are? He hated that question. Not because it was unfair, because it was honest. At a rest stop, Evan stepped out and leaned against the hood. A father helped his daughter practice parallel parking nearby. The girl laughed when she bumped the cone. "Try again," the father said. Calm, patient. Evan smiled despite himself. Back home later that evening, he sat at his desk and finally watched the traffic stop again. All of it. From the first flash of lights to the wave that sent him away. He noticed things he missed before. The speed of assumptions, the way authority filled the quiet, how quickly truth mattered only after it wore a title. Alana called while the video played. "You still thinking about it?" she asked. "Yeah," Evan said, "but not the way I used to." "What way now?" "How easy it is for things to go wrong when nobody checks themselves." The next week, Evan spoke at a high school in Flagstaff, Arizona. No podium, no speech prepared, just a classroom and curious faces. One student raised his hand. "Were you scared?" Evan answered honestly. "I was careful." Another asked, "What should we do if that happens to us?" Evan paused, choosing words a 12-year-old could carry. "Know your rights. Stay calm. Record if you can. And never assume silence means fairness." A teacher thanked him afterward. They'll remember that. Driving back, Evan felt lighter than he had in months. Not healed. Not untouched. Just clearer. At home, he drafted a short post. Nothing emotional. Just practical. If you're stopped, ask why. Keep your hands visible. You have the right to record. He didn't attach his name. It spread anyway. Weeks later, he received a message from a college student in Prescott, Arizona. "I watched your story with my dad." It read, "He's a cop. We talked longer than we ever have." Evan stared at the screen for a long time. That message mattered more than the settlement, more than the coverage, more than the meetings, because it meant something shifted. One evening, Evan pulled his car into the garage and shut the door behind him. The echo faded. The house felt settled. He realized something that surprised him. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want recognition. He wanted fewer people to feel what he felt on that road. Before bed, he texted Alana. "I think the lesson is simple," he wrote. "Power needs witnesses." She replied a minute later, "And courage needs practice." Evan set the phone down. This story didn't end with a siren. It ended with awareness, with quiet corrections, with conversations that didn't exist before. If you're watching this, remember something important. Moments don't always become history because they're loud. They become history because someone refuses to let them fade. If this story made you think, share it. If it felt familiar, speak up. And if you ever find yourself in a moment where truth is questioned, protect it, even calmly, especially calmly. Change doesn't always arrive in uniform or courtrooms. Sometimes it shows up when regular people decide not to stay silent.